I never intended to turn my resignation letter into a weapon until HR read it aloud to the entire company. 5 minutes later, the VP's face went sheet white while I just sat there, calm as if watching a movie whose ending I already knew. They thought this was a quiet goodbye, but really, it was a verdict. My name is Nathaniel Green, and at 34, I'd spent the last 8 years building the operations department at Ardent Systems from the ground up. We manufactured medical devices, the kind that kept people alive in ICUs and operating rooms across the country. It wasn't glamorous work, but it mattered. Every procedure, every checkpoint, every tedious form I insisted on, they all stood between a patient and potential catastrophe. That Tuesday morning started like any other. I arrived at 7:30, coffee in hand, ready to review the quarterly compliance reports. The office hummed with its usual energy, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, and the distant whir of the 3D printers in the prototype lab. I had just settled into my desk when Leo from HR knocked on my doorframe. "Morning meeting in conference room A," he said, his smile a bit too bright. "Evan wants to introduce some new initiatives." Evan Ross, our newly appointed Vice President of Transformation, was handpicked by the CEO just 3 months ago. He'd swept in from some tech startup, all sharp suits and sharper PowerPoints, promising to revolutionize our archaic processes. The man had never worked a day in medical manufacturing, but apparently that made him perfect for the job. I gathered my reports, the ones I'd spent the weekend perfecting, cross-referencing every data point against FDA regulations. An old habit, maybe, but I believed in paper trails. Digital systems could be edited, deleted, manipulated. Paper told the truth. The conference room was already packed when I arrived. Evan stood at the head of the table, his silver laptop gleaming like a weapon. He barely glanced up as I took my seat. "Now that everyone's here," he began, not waiting for me to actually sit down, "let's talk about why Ardent Systems is hemorrhaging money." The room tensed. We weren't hemorrhaging anything. Our margins were healthy. Our safety record was impeccable. But Evan had graphs, colorful, animated graphs that danced across the screen, showing how our antiquated methods were costing us theoretical millions. "Take operations, for example," he said, and I knew what was coming. "Nathaniel, would you mind sharing what you brought?" I stood, holding my bound report, 80 pages of meticulous documentation, tracking every product line, every quality check, every successful audit. "This is this quarter's operational review." A paper report. Evan's voice dripped with disdain. He plucked it from my hands before I could react. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly the problem. We're living in the digital age, and some departments are still churning out dead trees." He held my report up like evidence in a trial. "This represents everything wrong with our current system. Hours wasted on manual compilation, resources drained on printing and binding, a relic of pre-digital thinking." Then he did it in one smooth motion. He dropped my report into the waste bin beside the podium. The thud echoed in the silent room. "From now on, all reporting goes through our new cloud-based platform. No exceptions." I stood there, watching 3 months of my work sit among coffee cups and granola bar wrappers. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't waver. I simply nodded and sat back down. But as Evan continued his presentation, showing off his half-finished digital platform with its pretty interfaces and missing security protocols, I made a decision. He thought he'd just thrown away some paper. He had no idea he had just lit a fuse. I pulled out my phone under the table and created a new folder in my personal cloud storage. I named it simply Documentation. The meeting droned on, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was planning. The transformation began immediately. Within days of that meeting, Evan's digital revolution swept through Ardent Systems like a virus. The new platform, CloudOps 3.0, as he called it, was mandatory for all departments. No exceptions, no transition period. "We're going live Monday," he announced at the Friday afternoon huddle. "I want every process, every report, every communication flowing through CloudOps. Anyone still using legacy systems after Monday will be written up." Legacy systems? That's what he called the FDA-compliant procedures we'd spent years perfecting. The ones that had earned us a spotless inspection record for 7 consecutive years. I spent that weekend migrating our critical data. But something was wrong. Cloud Ops had been designed for a software company, not medical manufacturing. There were no fields for lot traceability, no automatic flags for expiration dates, no built-in validation steps required by regulatory bodies. We'll add those features in version 2.0, Evan said when I raised these concerns Monday morning. For now, just use the notes section. The notes section for tracking life-critical medical devices. But Evan had allies. The younger managers, hungry for recognition, fell in line immediately. They loved the sleek interface, the real-time dashboards, the ability to approve workflows from their phones while golfing. HR was particularly enamored. Cloud Ops had a built-in performance tracking module that generated beautiful pie charts of employee engagement. I watched our quality control manager, Thomas, struggle with the new system. 58 years old, 3 decades of experience, reduced to hunting and pecking at a tablet, trying to input test results into fields that weren't designed for them. Just approximate, his supervisor told him, round to the nearest whole number if the decimal places don't fit. Round the test results. I started my documentation in earnest. Then came screenshots of every conversation in Cloud Ops, downloads of every report showing missing data, photos of Thomas's handwritten notes, the ones he kept despite the paperless mandate, showing the actual test results versus what the system recorded. The first real incident came 3 weeks in. A production run of insulin pumps showed anomalies in the pressure testing phase. The old system would have automatically halted production, triggered a quality review, and notified the floor supervisor. Cloud Ops simply logged it as a variance and kept the line running. I caught it during my morning review, a habit Evan hadn't managed to break yet. 800 units had been manufactured after the failed test. 800 potentially defective insulin pumps sitting in boxes ready to ship. Pull them, I told the warehouse manager. Every single unit. Full quarantine. Evan approved them for shipping this morning. He replied, showing me his tablet. Sure enough, there was Evan's digital signature. Timestamp, 6:23 a.m. He couldn't have reviewed the test data. The full results weren't even uploaded until 7:15. The warehouse manager shrugged. He approved them in the system. That's all I need. I ran to Evan's office, my dress shoes clicking against the polished floor like a countdown. He was on a video call with investors, gesturing at his wall-mounted screen, showing Cloud Ops' revolutionary efficiency metrics. I waited 5 minutes, then 10. Finally, he noticed me and held up a finger. Another 5 minutes. What's the emergency, Nathaniel? He didn't invite me to sit. The insulin pumps. You approved a shipment with failed pressure tests. The variance was within acceptable limits. What variance? The full data wasn't even available when you signed off. He turned his monitor toward me. Cloud Ops' predictive algorithm indicated a 94% probability of compliance based on historical data. That's good enough. Predictive? Evan, we're not predicting the weather. These are medical devices. They need actual testing, not probability scores. This is exactly the kind of pre-digital thinking that's holding us back. He turned back to his screen. The shipment goes out as scheduled. I stood there, my hands clenched so tight my nails dug into my palms. I need that in writing. He glanced up, annoyed. Everything in Cloud Ops is documented. Check the system. I did, but I also sent him an email summarizing our conversation, asking for confirmation of his decision to ship despite failed tests. He didn't respond, but the email server recorded that he opened it. Read receipt saved. That night, I stayed late copying files, taking photos, building my archive. The security guard found me at my desk at 2 a.m., surrounded by printouts. Working late again, Mr. Green? Just trying to keep up with all the innovation, I said. He laughed. Yeah, this new system's got everyone scrambling. If only he knew how much. The warning signs multiplied like cancer cells. First, it was the software glitches in the testing line. A decimal point that jumped 2 places in the sterilization temperature logs. A batch number that mysteriously changed itself halfway through production. Small things. Evan's team assured us they were growing pains of the new system. I started keeping a journal, Not the dramatic kind, just a simple Excel file on my personal laptop, encrypted and backed up to 3 different drives. Date, time, incident, personnel involved, potential clinical impact. Like a medical chart. October 15th, 8:47 a.m. Inventory system shows 10,000 units of cardiac monitors in stock. Physical count reveals 7,200. No explanation for discrepancy. October 23rd, 2:15 p.m. Quality assurance bypass approved by Ross for a rush order to a major children's hospital in Chicago. 2 required contamination tests skipped to meet the deadline. October 30th, 11 a.m. Internal audit report submitted incomplete. Missing sections on biocompatibility testing. Ross marks it reviewed and approved. Anyway, the pattern was clear to anyone who cared to look. But Evan had mastered the art of the beautiful dashboard. His presentations to the board showed green arrows pointing up, satisfaction scores soaring, efficiency metrics through the roof. Never mind that the data came from surveys sent to a carefully curated list of his supporters. Then came the coaching session. HR summoned me on a Thursday afternoon. Their newest recruit, barely out of college, sat across from me with a concerned expression she'd probably practiced in a mirror. "Nathaniel, we need to talk about your resistance to change," she began, sliding a formal coaching document across the table. "Several team members have expressed concern about your reluctance to embrace innovation." I scanned the paper. Generic corporate speak about fostering collaborative environments and championing transformational initiatives. At the bottom, a signature line. "Sign here to acknowledge you've been counseled." "Which team members?" I asked. "That's confidential. The important thing is moving forward positively." I signed. What else could I do? But I also took a photo of the document before handing it back. Another file from my growing collection. The real alarm bells started with the Rochester shipment. A rush order of respiratory monitors desperately needed for the Mayo Clinic's COVID ward. The new system had flagged them as ready to ship, all quality checks complete. But something nagged at me. I pulled up the actual test records, not the summary dashboard but the raw data files. Half the electromagnetic interference, EMI, tests were missing. The ones that ensured our monitors wouldn't interfere with other critical equipment. The kind of interference that could shut down a ventilator or scramble pacemaker. I brought it to Evan immediately. He was in his corner office, the one with the standing desk and the mini putting green. "The tests were probably run, but not logged properly," he said without looking up from his screen. "The system sometimes has lag time in updating." "Evan, we cannot ship these units without. The hospital needs them by Monday." "We ship." He finally met my eyes. "Unless you want to personally explain to dying patients why their monitors are sitting in our warehouse over a paperwork issue." "It's not paperwork, it's safety. The decision is made. Log your concern if you must, but we ship." I did log it, in triplicate. I emailed my concern to him, to quality assurance, to regulatory affairs. I printed the emails. I saved the read receipts. I documented his verbal override with timestamps and direct quotes. The shipment went out Friday afternoon. I spent the weekend sick to my stomach, refreshing news sites, praying I wouldn't see headlines about hospital equipment failures in Rochester. Monday came and went, no disasters. Evan made sure to mention in the all-hands meeting how his decisive leadership had saved lives by getting critical equipment delivered on time. But I kept watching, kept documenting, because I knew, the way you know a storm is coming when the air pressure drops, that this was building to something catastrophic. And when it happened, I would be ready with every piece of evidence, every bypassed protocol, every ignored warning. I wasn't building a case. I was building a bomb, one made entirely of truth. The breaking point came on a cold Thursday morning in November. I had just finished reviewing the export documentation for our largest international shipment of a year, cardiac defibrillators bound for the European Union. 2,000 units worth nearly $12 million. The paperwork was a disaster. CE marking certificates were expired. Electromagnetic compatibility tests were missing. The declaration of conformity was signed by someone who'd left the company 3 months ago. In the old system, these documents would have been flagged, verified, and triple-checked. In Cloud Ops, they were just PDF attachments in a folder marked EU, ready to ship. But it was the biocompatibility report that stopped my heart. The tests were there, technically, but the dates are wrong. According to the documentation, we'd completed biotesting on materials that hadn't even arrived at our facility yet. Time travel, apparently, was one of Cloud Ops' revolutionary features. I printed everything, not on my desk. Evan had installed monitoring software on the network printers. Instead, I used the old printer in the basement storage room, the one IT had forgotten to decommission. Page after page of evidence building my case. That afternoon, I made my decision. I opened a new document on my personal laptop. Not Cloud Ops, not the company network, just a simple Word file on my machine. And I began to write. Dear Human Resources, I am writing to formally notify you of my resignation from Arden Systems, effective 2 weeks from today's date. After 8 years of dedicated service, I find myself unable to continue in an environment where patient safety is consistently subordinated to efficiency metrics. During my tenure, I have been proud to contribute to Arden Systems' reputation for quality and compliance. However, recent organizational changes have created conditions that compromise our fundamental obligation to the patients who depend on our devices. I feel compelled to document the following concerns, each of which I have previously raised through appropriate channels. What followed was 2 pages of carefully crafted truth. No emotion, no accusations, just facts, dates, and references to the paper trail I'd been building. Each incident was linked to documented evidence. Each override was traced to its source. Each patient safety risk was outlined in clinical terms. I wrote about the Rochester shipment with missing EMI tests, the insulin pumps with failed pressure readings, the EU export documentation that violated international regulations. I named names only when necessary, quoted emails verbatim, and referenced Cloud Ops ticket numbers that anyone could verify. The masterpiece was in the final paragraph. I have maintained comprehensive documentation of these incidents in accordance with FDA Quality System Regulation 21 CFR 820.198, which requires the establishment and maintenance of complaint files. Copies of this documentation have been preserved for regulatory review as required by law. I trust that Arden Systems will take appropriate corrective action to address these systemic failures before they result in patient harm or regulatory sanctions. That last line was a knife. By invoking FDA regulations and mentioning preserved documentation, I created a legal obligation for the company to investigate. They couldn't bury this, not without risking massive liability. I saved the file, uploaded it to 3 different cloud services, and emailed a copy to my personal lawyer with instructions to hold it. Then I crafted the email that would light the fuse. To HR@ardensystems.com. CC, CEO@ardensystems.com. Internal audit at ardensystems.com. BCC, my personal email. Subject, resignation, Nathaniel Green, Operations Director. The CC line was strategic. Including the CEO meant HR couldn't handle this quietly. Adding internal audit guaranteed the compliance team would see every word. The BCC to myself would prove when I sent it, what I sent, and who received it. My finger hovered over the send button. Once this went out, there was no going back. Evan would know I'd been documenting his failures. HR would realize I'd created a paper trail they couldn't ignore. The CEO would see that his star VP had been systematically violating regulations that could shut down our company. I thought about the insulin pumps, the cardiac monitors, the defibrillators heading to Europe, all those patients who had no idea their lives might depend on devices that hadn't been properly tested. I clicked send. The email disappeared from my screen, winging its way through the servers, about to explode in inboxes across the executive suite. I leaned back in my chair and checked the time, 4:47 p.m. In 13 minutes, HR would be leaving for the day. They'd see it first thing tomorrow morning. I closed my laptop and went back to work, processing invoices, reviewing schedules, acting like I hadn't just armed a bomb. But in my desk drawer, locked and ready, sat a USB drive containing every piece of evidence, my insurance policy, my weapon. Tomorrow, HR would start their process. They'd print my letter, schedule a meeting, follow protocol. They had no idea what they'd be reading aloud. Friday morning arrived wrapped in gray clouds and the promise of rain. I reached the office at my usual time, coffee in hand, acting out my regular routine. The email had been sitting in inboxes for over 12 hours. The fuse was lit, burning slowly toward detonation. At 8:15, I saw Leo from HR hurrying past my office, his face tight with concern. He clutched a manila folder, freshly printed pages visible at the edges. My resignation letter transformed from pixels to paper. By 8:30, the executive floor was buzzing. Through the glass walls, I saw a batch of suited figures moving between offices, heads bent in urgent conversation. The CEO's assistant made 3 trips to the printer in 15 minutes. I continued working, answered emails, approved purchase orders, and updated the production schedule in Cloud Ops, making sure to note every instance where the system defaulted to incorrect values. Business as usual, except for the earthquake building beneath the surface. At 9:45, my phone rang. Leo's voice, carefully professional. "Nathaniel, could you please join us in conference room C at 10 o'clock? We'd like to discuss your recent communication." "Of course," I replied. "Should I bring anything?" A pause. "No, that won't be necessary. We have everything we need." "I'll bet you do," I thought. The 15-minute wait was deliberate torture. I used it to forward several key files to my personal email, update my out-of-office message, and slip the USB drive into my jacket pocket. At 9:58, I stood, straightened my tie, and walked to conference room C. The gathering was larger than I'd expected. Leo sat at the far end of the table with James, the senior HR director. Evan occupied his usual power position at the head, trying to project confidence despite the slight tremor in his hands. The CEO, Richard Brennan, sat to his right, a rare appearance for a resignation meeting. Most interesting were the 2 additions, David from Internal Audit and Martin from Legal. The band was all here for the performance. "Nathaniel," Richard began, his voice carefully neutral. "Thank you for joining us. We've received your resignation letter and wanted to discuss it with you." I took my seat, folded my hands, and waited. The silence stretched until Leo cleared his throat. "Per company protocol," he said, lifting my printed letter, "we need to review the contents of your resignation to ensure all parties understand the circumstances of your departure." This was at the moment I'd engineered. In their adherence to HR procedure, they were about to read my indictment aloud to the very people who needed to hear it. Leo began, "Dear Human Resources, I am writing to formally notify you of my resignation from Ardent Systems, effective 2 weeks from today's date." I watched Evan as he read. His expression shifted from irritation to concern as he reached the documented incidents. By the time he got to the Rochester shipment, his face had drained of color. Cardiac monitors shipped without electromagnetic interference testing, approved by EROS, despite written warnings about patient safety risks. Richard's pen scratched across his legal pad, taking notes. David from Internal Audit was typing furiously on his laptop, likely pulling up the Cloud Ops records I'd referenced. Insulin pumps with failed pressure tests showing variances of up to 15% beyond acceptable parameters, approved for distribution based on predictive algorithms rather than actual quality data. Martin from Legal had his poker face on, but I caught him exchanging glances with Richard. They both understood the implications: FDA violations, potential recalls, lawsuits, export documentation with expired certificates and fraudulent testing dates, indicating biocompatibility tests completed on materials not yet received by our facility. That's when Evan cracked. "This is ridiculous," he interjected. "These are minor documentation issues blown out of proportion by someone resistant to change." "Let him finish," Richard said quietly. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Leo continued, his voice growing smaller as he realized what he was reading. "Comprehensive documentation of these incidents maintained in accordance with FDA Quality System Regulation 21, CFR 820. Copies preserved for regulatory review as required by law." The final paragraph landed like a judge's gavel. When Leo finished, the room sat in absolute silence. Richard spoke first. "David, can you verify these CloudOps ticket numbers? Already pulling them up, David replied. The Rochester shipment? Yes, here it is. EMI testing showing incomplete. Override approval at 6:47 a.m. by. He glanced at Evan. By VP Ross. The EU shipment. Richard's voice was dangerously quiet. Scheduled to leave the warehouse at 2 p.m. today, I offered helpfully. $12 million worth of non-compliant devices. The documentation is still in CloudOps if you'd like to review it. He straightened in his chair, attempting to salvage something from the wreckage. These are process improvements that require adjustment periods, he began. The efficiency gains stop, Richard cut him off. The EU shipment, the one Nathaniel flagged. Where is it? Held at the warehouse, Martin confirmed. We caught it 90 minutes before departure. The documentation discrepancies he identified were significant. Shipping would have violated EU medical device regulations and triggered immediate sanctions. That's a $12 million shipment, one board member noted, plus potential fines of up to 4% of global revenue under EU MDR violations. You're talking about hundreds of millions in losses. Richard stood slowly, his movements deliberate. Evan, effective immediately. Your signing authority is suspended pending a full audit. All decisions requiring VP approval will route through my office. Evan's face flushed. This is an overreaction to what? Richard's voice rose for the first time. To you nearly shipping non-compliant medical devices to our largest international market? To overriding safety protocols on products that keep people alive? To creating a documentation trail of negligence that plaintiffs' attorneys dream about? He turned to me. Nathaniel, the board has asked me to request that you reconsider your resignation. We need your expertise to unwind this mess and implement proper protocols. I'd expected this. They always wanted the whistleblower to stay and clean up, to own the solution to the problem they tried to prevent. I appreciate the offer, I said calmly, but my resignation stands. I've included transition documentation in my files. Everything you need to restore compliance is there. Your bonus, Richard tried. We can discuss significant retention incentives. My decision is final. I stood, gathering my things. However, I'll honor my 2-week notice to ensure a smooth transition. As I reached the door, Richard delivered the final blow to Evan. The board has also decided to forfeit your Q4 performance bonus pending the audit results. Given the potential liability you've exposed us to, you should consider yourself fortunate if that's the only consequence. Evan's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. His $100,000 bonus, the one he'd been bragging about, evaporated in front of his eyes. I paused at the door, allowing myself one glance back. Evan sat frozen, staring at the table, his empire of efficiency crumbling around him. The other executives were already moving on, discussing damage control, audit procedures, regulatory notifications. Nathaniel, Richard called out, thank you for your integrity, for your documentation, for protecting our patients when we failed to. I nodded once and left. The meeting continued behind me, but my part was done. I delivered the evidence, triggered the investigation, and watched the architect of our near-disaster face his reckoning. The best revenge, I'd learned, was simply letting the truth speak for itself. And today, it had spoken volumes. The audit results came faster than anyone expected. By Tuesday of my final week, internal audit had uncovered what they termed systemic compliance failures across multiple product lines. The investigation had spread like ink in water, revealing problems even I hadn't documented. I was filing my last batch of transition notes when Richard appeared at my office door, followed by Martin from legal and 2 people I didn't recognize, external auditors, by their conservative suits and serious expressions. Nathaniel, we need a moment, Richard said. His face bore the exhaustion of someone who'd been living in crisis mode. They filed in, and Martin closed the door behind them. What we're about to discuss is highly confidential, he began. We've discovered additional issues with the EU shipment. One of the external auditors opened his laptop. The biocompatibility tests that showed impossible dates. They weren't just misdated. They were fabricated. The testing lab has no record of ever receiving our samples. My stomach dropped. This was worse than incompetence. This was fraud. Evan, I asked, though I already knew the answer. He pressured a junior quality engineer to create the documents, Richard confirmed. The engineer came forward yesterday after learning about the investigation. He has emails where Evan explicitly instructed him to make the paperwork match the shipping deadline. That's criminal fraud, I said quietly. The FDA, EU regulators, they'll pursue charges. Which is why we need your complete documentation, Martin said. Everything you collected. We're self-reporting to the FDA tomorrow, and your evidence will be crucial in demonstrating that senior management took action as soon as we became aware. I retrieved the USB drive from my jacket. Everything's here chronologically organized, with backup documentation for each incident. As they reviewed the files, Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his expression darkened further. "Excuse me," he said, stepping out. We sat in tense silence until he returned, his face grave. That was the CEO of Meridian Health Systems. They've been tracking adverse events with our insulin pumps, the ones Evan shipped despite failed pressure tests. 3 patients have experienced delivery failures. No fatalities, thank God, but 1 child is in the ICU. The room went cold. This was no longer about money or compliance. Lives hung in the balance. Full recall? I asked. Already initiated. Martin from legal was already on his phone, presumably calling the warehouse. Richard turned to Evan, who seemed to have shrunk in his chair. "Conference room A. Now, just you and me." He stood, then looked back at me. "Nathaniel, please remain available. We'll need to discuss transition plans." As I left, I caught Evan's eye. He'd walked into this room, thinking he'd be managing my quiet exit. Instead, he had just had his failures read into the official record in front of the CEO, legal, and internal audit. The meeting that was supposed to process my resignation had become his trial. And we weren't even at the verdict yet. The reconvened meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. 5 hours of investigation, verification, and what I imagined were increasingly frantic phone calls between executives, lawyers, and board members. I spent the time cleaning out my desk, each personal item carefully wrapped and placed in a box. My colleagues avoided eye contact, sensing the storm brewing in the executive offices. At 1:45, Thomas from Quality Control stopped by. "Heard you're leaving," he said quietly. "Also heard why. Thank you, Nathaniel, for saying what we couldn't." I nodded, understanding the weight behind his words. Whistleblowers rarely survived in corporate America, but sometimes the truth needed a kamikaze pilot. The conference room had been rearranged when I returned. Gone was the casual seating from a morning. Now it resembled a courtroom. Executives on one side, me on the other, with HR maintaining neutral territory in the middle. The attendee list had expanded. Richard brought 2 board members who dialed in via video conference. Legal had multiplied into a team of 3. Internal audit had their laptops open, screens full of data. And Evan sat at the far end, looking like he'd aged 5 years in as many hours. "Nathaniel," Richard began, his tone formal. "We've spent the morning reviewing the concerns outlined in your resignation letter. The board has requested a full presentation of your documentation. This wasn't standard procedure. This was an inquisition. Before we begin," Martin from legal interjected, "we need to establish that this meeting is being recorded for compliance purposes. Do you consent to the recording?" "I do," I replied. "Let them create their own evidence." Richard nodded to HR. "Please proceed with the full reading of the resignation letter for the board's benefit." And so Leo read it again. Every word, every incident, every regulatory citation. But this time, the audience was different. Board members who understood liability, lawyers who calculated damages, auditors who saw systemic failure. When he finished, Richard turned to David. "Present your findings." David's presentation was methodical devastation. He found everything I'd documented and more. The CloudOps system had actually preserved evidence of Evan's overrides that even I hadn't discovered. Timestamps showing approvals made before test results were available. Automatic alerts dismissed without review. Quality holds released with no justification. In the past 90 days, David summarized, we've identified 47 instances of safety protocol overrides. 38 of these resulted in product shipments. The potential exposure is, he paused, checking his calculations, approximately $64 million in shipped inventory that may not meet regulatory standards. One of the board members unmuted. $64 million in potential recalls. That's just the product value, Martin added. It doesn't include regulatory fines, legal settlements, or reputational damage if any of these devices fail in the field. The room turned to Evan. Every unit from that batch, nationwide. Marketing is preparing the FDA notification now. Richard turned to me, and I saw something I'd never seen in 8 years. Fear in his eyes. Nathaniel, the board has made a decision. Evan Ross's employment is terminated, effective immediately. Security is escorting him from the building as we speak. Through my office window, I could see the security team at Evan's corner office. He emerged carrying a single box, his designer suit wrinkled, his confident swagger replaced by the shuffle of defeat. Employees pretended to work, but everyone watched as he was marched to the elevator. Furthermore, Richard continued, we're recommending criminal charges to the Department of Justice. Falsifying medical device documentation is a federal crime, Martin added. Your documentation will be critical to the criminal case. We'll need you to testify if it goes to trial. I'll cooperate fully, I assured them. Richard stood, then paused. His bonus, he said, almost as an afterthought. Legal has confirmed we can claw back his entire compensation package for the year. The employment contract has a fraud clause. Not just the Q4 bonus he'd lost in the meeting, but everything. Salary, stock options, benefits. All subject to recovery when an executive commits fraud. Evan hadn't just lost his job. He'd lost everything he'd earned while destroying our compliance culture. There's one more thing, Martin said. The young engineer who created the false documents. He kept audio recordings of his meetings with Evan. Legal insurance, he called it. He's turning everything over to the authorities. Audio recordings. Evan's own voice ordering fraud. Preserved forever. Even I hadn't thought to go that far. As they prepared to leave, Richard turned back one final time. The offer stands, Nathaniel. Name your price. We need someone with your integrity rebuilding our quality systems. Thank you, but no. Sometimes the best service I can provide is knowing when to leave. He nodded, understanding. We'll be in touch about the legal proceedings. And Nathaniel, the board asked me to tell you that your final paycheck will include a discretionary bonus for extraordinary service to patient safety. After they left, I sat in my nearly empty office, processing what had just unfolded. Evan hadn't just lost his bonus or his job. He'd lost his career, his reputation, potentially his freedom, all because he'd prioritized metrics over lives, efficiency over ethics. The Rochester shipment I'd flagged, the insulin pumps he'd forced through, the falsified EU documents. Each decision had been a thread in the rope he'd used to hang himself. I pulled up CloudOps one last time, looking at Evan's profile. Status, terminated. Access, revoked. His digital empire had vanished as quickly as it had been built. Outside, the rain had finally arrived, washing the city clean. Tomorrow would be my last day at Ardent Systems. But today, I'd watched justice delivered in real time, measured not in my careful documentation, but in a child fighting for life in an ICU bed. Evan had thought he was untouchable, protected by his metrics and his CEO's favor. He'd learned too late that in medical devices, as in life, the truth always surfaces. And when it does, it brings consequences that no dashboard can hide. My last day at Ardent Systems arrived with unexpected sunshine. The rain had washed away the gray, leaving the morning crisp and bright. I arrived early, wanting to savor these final hours in the building where I'd spent 8 years of my life. My office was bare except for the transition binders I prepared, detailed guides for my successor, whoever they might be. Each process documented, each contact annotated, each critical checkpoint highlighted. My real legacy wouldn't be the revenge or the revelation, but the foundation I'd leave for patient safety to continue. At 9 a.m., employees began stopping by. First, Thomas from quality control, then the warehouse manager, then engineers and analysts I'd worked with over the years. Each carried the same message. Thank you for standing up when no one else would. You saved lives, one young engineer said simply. That child in the ICU, he my nephew. The recalled insulin pump was his. I hadn't known. The universe has a way of making things personal. By noon, my desk was covered with cards, flowers, and small gifts. The same people who'd avoided eye contact on Monday now formed an impromptu farewell gathering. Even some of Evan's former allies appeared, perhaps recognizing that loyalty to bad leadership was its own kind of failure. Richard made his final appearance at 3 p.m., carrying an envelope in a leather portfolio. Your final check, he said, handing me the envelope, including the board-approved bonus. It's substantial. I didn't open it. The money had never been the point. And this, he continued, presenting the portfolio, is from the legal team. Copies of all the regulatory filings, the recall notices, and the criminal referral. They thought you should have a complete record of the impact you made. Inside were documents bearing the FDA seal, EU regulatory stamps, and Department of Justice letterhead. My resignation letter had triggered an avalanche that would reshape Arden Systems for years to come. Any word on Evan? I asked. Richard's expression hardened. Arrested yesterday. Federal marshals took him at his home. He's facing 14 counts of fraud, each carrying up to 20 years. His lawyer is already discussing plea deals. 20 years for a man who'd measured success in quarterly earnings. The math was devastating. At 4:30, I performed my final rituals, badge deactivation with security, laptop returned to IT, parking pass surrendered to facilities. Each mundane task marked the end of an era. The security guard at the front desk, the same one who'd found me working at 2 a.m., smiled as I approached. Heard what you did, Mr. Green. Takes guts to speak truth to power. Sometimes the truth speaks for itself, I replied. We just have to give it a voice. I handed him my access badge, watching as he deactivated it with a soft beep. Nathaniel Green, operations director, became just another visitor who would need to be escorted into the building. The revolving door loomed ahead, the same one Evan had been marched through days earlier. But where his exit had been a perp walk, mine was a choice. Where he'd left in disgrace, I left with dignity. I pushed through the door, feeling the weight of the building release me. On the sidewalk, I turned back once to look at Arden Systems' gleaming facade. Somewhere inside, new protocols were being written. Somewhere, patients were safer because I'd refused to stay silent. Somewhere, a child was recovering because faulty devices had been recalled in time. In my jacket pocket, the USB drive still rested. My insurance policy, now transformed into evidence for federal prosecutors. But the real evidence was in the lives that wouldn't be lost, the injuries that wouldn't occur, the families that wouldn't grieve because someone had finally said, enough. The afternoon sun warmed my face as I walked to my car. My phone buzzed with messages from recruiters. Other companies had already heard about the whistleblower who took down a VP. They wanted someone with my expertise, my integrity, my willingness to stand up for what's right. I consider their offers eventually, but today I just wanted to drive home, pour a glass of wine, and reflect on how a simple resignation letter had become a weapon of truth. Evan Ross had thought he was building an empire of efficiency. Instead, he constructed his own downfall, one shortcut at a time. He believed that metrics mattered more than lives, that dashboards could hide defects, that authority could override ethics. He'd been wrong on every count. As I drove away from Arden Systems for the last time, I allowed myself one small smile, not of joy at his destruction, but of satisfaction at a job completed. I protected the patients. I'd preserved the evidence. I'd proven that even in corporate America, truth could still triumph over power. The revolving door had closed behind me. But somewhere in that building, the reforms I'd forced would continue spinning, protecting lives for years to come. My resignation letter hadn't just ended my career at Arden Systems. It had ended an era of dangerous negligence. And sometimes, that's the greatest success of all. The truth, delivered at exactly the right moment, to exactly the right people in exactly the right way. Checkmate. Thank you so much for listening to this story of corporate justice and the power of truth. Where are you tuning in from today? I'd love to hear in the comments below. Let's connect across the miles. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your own thoughts or experiences with standing up for what's right in the workplace. Your stories inspire our community, and together, we prove that integrity still matters in the corporate world.